All right. Well, we are going to go ahead and get started with our introduction. Welcome, everyone. We have some folks still kind of logging in, but we are going to move ahead with saying hello and introducing the topic and our speakers for today. So today we have a webinar, Screening in Trauma-Prone Organizations, to screen or not to screen, depends on what you need. And we have two distinguished speakers, Professor Neil Greenberg and Professor David Forbes. Professor Greenberg is a clinical and academic psychiatrist based at King's College London in the UK. He is a specialist in adult, occupational, and forensic psychiatry. He served in the United Kingdom Armed Forces for more than 23 years, deploying as a psychiatrist and researcher to a number of hostile environments, including Afghanistan and Iraq. At King's, Neil is a senior member of the Military Mental Health Research Team and a principal investigator within a nationally funded health protection research unit, which investigates the psychological impacts of trauma on organizations. Neil also runs March on Stress, which is a psychological health consultancy. He is past chair of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, Special Interest Group in Occupational Psychiatry, as well as having led on the 2023 World Psychiatric Association's position statement on mental health in the workplace. Professor David Forbes is a clinical psychologist and international expert in the assessment and treatment of mental health problems in trauma survivors, with specialty in military, veteran, emergency, and disaster mental health and problematic anger and trauma impacted populations. He is based out of Phoenix, Australia, Center for Post-Traumatic Mental Health, Department of Psychiatry at the University of Melbourne. Professor Forbes has published over 230 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters and co-edited the book, Anger at Work, Examining Anger in High-Risk Occupations. David is chair of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, Prevention and Treatment of PTSD, Clinical Guidelines Committee, and led the development of the inaugural Australian PTSD guidelines approved by the National Health and Medical Research Council in 2007, revised in 2013 and 2020. He's also co-chair of the Executive Council for the Victorian Statewide Trauma Service, commissioned as an outcome of the Royal Commission into Mental Health in Victoria. So we are just very lucky to have both speakers here today, and I'm going to turn it over to them to start today's presentation.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and thank you very much for inviting us to do this presentation today, this webinar today. So the title, as Melissa had mentioned, is Screening in Trauma-Prone Organisations, to screen or not to screen. It depends on what you mean. And this was a webinar that Dr. Greenberg and I, or Neil and I, put together in the aftermath of publishing an editorial in this area, probably towards the end of last year, in the journal Occupational Medicine. We were able to kind of detail some of our thinking around what are some of the key issues to be thinking about in relation to screening, the evidence base for it, and what's some ways to be thinking about what that means for screening in high-risk organisations. So the opportunity to turn this into a webinar has been much appreciated. Thank you. Next slide, please, Neil. So I'm going to go through some of the background. I'll also go through some of the issues for consideration, and then some of the things that we need to bear in mind when we're thinking about the topic of screening. And then I'll turn over to Neil to talk about what the evidence base is, what do we know, and then I'll summarise at the end in relation to where does that lead to and what are some of those implications. But in terms of context, there's been lots of interest in mental health screening protocols, particularly in organisations where the work was kind of routinely exposed to psychosocial hazards. The key organisations we're talking about here are predominantly military organisations, first responders or emergency workers, and really in the aftermath of COVID then, kind of more recently, healthcare workers. And there's a lot of applications for screening in the high-risk organisations, and there's a lot of points at which we could be thinking about in the life cycle of an emergency service worker or a military member. But one of the more common, and one of the ones where we'll be thinking and talking a bit more about today, is really where screening is used routinely or post-event to do kind of one of four things, or in fact all of four things. So one is the identification early of any adjustment difficulties that might be relating to some work exposure that the work has been exposed to facilitate subsequently then early intervention, to promote recovery and resilience. If identified as having an adjustment problem, then to use that to be able to circumvent any further exposures that might then generate further exacerbations in this emerging vulnerability, and then to optimise potential retention in the role. Ultimately, when workers join military or other first responder or emergency worker organisations, they're very committed to the agenda, they're very committed to the role and the mission of those organisations, and to be able to screen with the possibility of having the impacts above really is aimed to be able to keep someone well and healthy despite what can be a very difficult job to do. Next slide, please, now. And while we talk about the fact that screening has been used across a range of organisations, we need to acknowledge that this is something that's been kind of widespread internationally. It's not just Australia, it's not just the US. There's a whole range of countries where screening has become popular, or the conversations have been popular. And important to say also that it's something that is also very high profile within the media. And these are just some examples of the fact that this is a topic that gets a lot of international attention and a lot of international media attention. Next slide, please, now. Some of the issues are, though, that despite the fact that there's reasonably widespread use of screening in these organisations, up until now there's been fairly scant research about how effective these screening programs actually are. So it's unclear for an organisation whether screening should be an organisational risk mitigation strategy or not. And if it is, how would it be organised? How is it best implemented? And part of the cautions around that really are that it's not as though it comes, if it's not effective, that it comes without risk. And when we think about the risks attached to it, there's really kind of two things we're thinking about. One is the risk around opportunity cost. Depending on the size of the workforce, depending on the size of the mental health support around that workforce, it has potential to consume a lot of resources that could otherwise be deployed effectively to support the mental health of staff. So there's the opportunity cost factor. But the other is what the risks of a false negative or a false positive indication are, really, where in organisations where people are underreporting or there's a false negative, it does run the risk of giving false reassurance to the organisation or to commanders, leaders or managers of those organisations around what the health of their workforce actually is. Or alternatively, if someone is having a fleeting reaction to an event or an experience, the risk of that actually then getting interpreted in a more concerning way, where there's a risk of stigma around illness, when in fact the reaction may have been more fleeting. So there is a risk of kind of false identification in both ways. Next slide, please. Further creating some challenge is that there's been a couple of issues or topics really that have the potential to obfuscate the debate even further. And one is that there are multiple interpretations about what's actually meant by screening, resulting in conversations that can potentially be at cross purposes, where people are referring to what can be quite dissimilar processes in the discussions around, does screening work? What does it mean? How is it effective? Is it effective? What are the best components of it? Really, there's a lot of, often we're talking about dissimilar processes. So there needs to be clarity and specificity around what's meant by screening in these conversations. Secondly, when we think about screening, we also need to think about screening within a system, and that it's very hard to be thinking about one component without thinking about how everything fits together in the real world. And both of these are issues that the conversation or any literature evaluation needs to be cognizant of when it's making a discussion or having considerations about, is screening effective? And I'll just go into those in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please, now. So for the first factor, which is the multiple interpretations of what's meant by screening. So as just two examples, really, would we consider systematic training of supervisors, and then supervisors then using that training to systematically check in on their staff post-incident, having a routine way in which they would be observing staff, asking the questions and checking in? Would we consider that a form of screening? Or when we think about and talk about screening, are we reserving that more for kind of structured online or in-person healthcare delivered assessments? You use similar processes that we would use in other kind of problem or potential diagnostic detection processes. Next slide, please now. The second factor is it is that point about screening being part of a system where all of the pieces need to fit together for something to be effective. So it's hard to have a conversation about the screening work without thinking about dismantling it bits and are each of these bits right and have the bits been joined? Are the tools we're using, are they valid and effective measures of what we're trying to detect? Is there the time available and then effective and acceptable interventions available for the workforce should anything be identified? Do staff feel confident that they can answer honestly without disincentives around honest responding? Even if the tools are right, the interventions are right, in the absence of that element, is an interference factor in relation to the impact of screening or the success of screening. And then those who are identified need to engage fully with the post-identification process. So like a plumbing system, if we're talking about turning a tap on and the sink filling up, what it needs is each component part to be the correct component part, but it also requires all of the bits in between to be well connected for that system to work. And it's very hard to have a conversation about one part of the process being effective without mindfulness around all of the parts. So with that, just by way of introduction then to highlight some points for your consideration in the back of your mind, I'll turn over to Neil to talk through where are we with the evidence at the moment. Thank you, Neil.
Thanks very much, David. Okay, so I'm going to run through some of the evidence as it stands on different elements of screening. And the first is what's called pre-screening. And so pre-screening is what you might do to identify vulnerability before someone goes into a particular job or before they go into a particular role if they go into the job. So, for instance, if you were in the media and you wanted to go out and become a war correspondent, once you're in the media organisation, should the media organisation allow you or send you off to a war zone, or if you want to join the police or the military and predictably you're going to get exposed to trauma, should you get screened beforehand? So I'm not sure if you recognise this chap. This is General Marshall. He was Chief of Staff of the US Army at the end of the Second World War. And without meaning to, he did an amazingly good experiment on pre-screening. So in 1939, if you wanted to join the US Army, you had to see a psychologist or psychiatrist, so someone who looked like David or me, which is frightening in itself, I'm sure. And they determined whether you had the right stuff or you were made of true grit, or whatever cheesy phrase that you might think of. If you weren't deemed to have enough grit or to have the right stuff, you couldn't join up. But in 1943, the US Army ran out of recruits. And so General Marshall, who was in charge of personnel at the time, overturned that policy. And all those people who were deemed to be lacking in grit or not having the real stuff were allowed to join the military. In fact, they were made to join the military with conscription. And so they went through plenty of trauma during D-Day and victory in the Pacific. And they found that about 80%, 80% of people who had been screened out as not being psychologically robust enough went on and had a perfectly good war. So the screening was wrong 4 times in 5, which if you have a big organization like the military or like an emergency responder organization means that there's a lot of applicants who you're going to exclude who actually could do the job well. Our research team at King's repeated the Marshall experiment in a slightly more scientific way back in around 2003. So we had gathered data on about 3,000 British troops in 2002. We didn't know there was going to be a war the next year, but we were doing some data collection anyway. When troops got sent to war, our British troops went in 2003 as part of the original sort of invasion force. Luckily, 1,600 staff who had completed the data collection in 2002 got sent to Iraq. So what we did is look back at our data that we gathered the year before and said, could we predict who of those troops would go on and develop problems? And then we followed them up in 2004. So we were trying to predict which of these troops here would develop problems here when we followed them up here, if that makes sense. And this is the overall data. And so back in 2002, we identified 33 people who we thought would potentially be at high risk of having mental health problems. They scored really high on questionnaires, high enough that you would say there's no way that you would let that individual deploy because they're just too vulnerable. But after the war, actually only 6 of them still had mental health difficulties. And so 27 of them went on and had a perfectly good war from a psychological point of view. And if you work that out, that basically means that our positive predictive value was about 20%. So we were wrong once again about 80% of the time. And you might think, well, that's okay, because we still would have stopped 6 people developing problems, or even if we wrongly classified at 27. But in fact, there's 41 people here who we said back in 2002, they're completely okay, they're fit to go, and they develop problems afterwards. And so basically this study basically once again showed that trying to predict who's going to have difficulties during a conflict where there's lots of different exposure to trauma, it's a fool's game and it doesn't work well. This is a study done in Australian police in New South Wales, which I think is where not that far from where David is. And this was looking at people who joined the New South Wales police force. So when they joined the police force, they have lots of psychological health assessments, but the research team went to them and said, look, we're not part of your assessment process, but would you complete this MMPI, which, as you probably know, is a comprehensive measure of psychopathology. And so they got these recruits to complete the MMPI, thinking that the MMPI would predict something in their mental health over the next few years. They followed them up for 7 years, and they found their MMPI score on entry predicted absolutely nothing. So it was not effective at trying to work out who did go on to develop problems and who didn't. And so basically just saying here, the pre-screening thing is very attractive. If we could do this, we would like to, but really the evidence we have so far is we can't do it properly. And as David said, the difficulty here, the danger here, is that if you pre-screen groups of people going into arduous jobs, you make the assumption that if they screen as being okay, that they're going to be able to cope with the job well. And in fact, that's not necessarily the case. The pre-screening really doesn't add anything. All it has the chance to do is to exclude people who could do the job, but you just think they're too vulnerable based on a questionnaire or pre-screening interview. What about ongoing screening that you might use in sort of general workplaces? Well, there's a very good study which came out last year in Occupational and Environmental Medicine that you probably know is a particularly good journal to get a paper in. And this basically looked at 8 randomized controlled trials, so high quality evidence. You can see where they're from: the Netherlands, USA, UK, and Belgium. And these are the different settings that they were held in. And you can see these are general non-traumatic workplaces. Overall, implementing screening programs with nearly 3,000 people in RCTs didn't result in improved worker health. There was a small and weak benefit in people who not just got screened, but who got screened, identified as having a problem, and then someone says, right, John, right, Neil, we're going to take you to go and see a healthcare professional. However, that only worked if that assistance to go and get care was anonymous to the organization. So actually, if you screened within an organization, say the occupational health or the staff welfare people said, okay, Neil, we spotted you got a problem, let's get you help. That didn't work. It was only screening that was carried out where no one in your organization would know what your results are. And the follow-ups were mostly 6 months, but there were a few trials that had a 5-year follow-up. There were 2 of them that looked at sickness absence data, and they found that even if you then help people get to the screening, it made no difference. So the longest trials, 2 of them, found that whether you screen people and just gave them advice, or you screen people and help them to go to get care, it didn't make any difference. What about in trauma-exposed workforces, emergency services, military, social care, healthcare settings? Well, this was a study done by the US Army, and the US Army back at the beginning of the Operation Iraqi Freedom back in 2003, operations in Iraq, they did some research and they implemented a very wide-reaching mental health screening program for US troops. And then a few years later, they decided to evaluate this. Now, this study is not a randomized controlled trial, it's an evaluation of a screening program. And it was published in JAMA, which again, as you'll know, is a very good journal. We'll be very happy to have a paper there. And it included, over 56,000 troops in this particular evaluation. And I'll run you through what this data shows. This is the outcome table. So basically 56,000 troops roughly were screened. They filled in questionnaires just after they came back from deployment. 6.2 of those scored high enough on the questionnaire that it raised a suspicion that they might have a mental health problem, particularly PTSD. And so they were referred to see a healthcare practitioner. So all 3,474 saw a healthcare practitioner who had their results, and they did an interview with them. And on the basis of that interview, 804 of them were told, right, you should go and get some mental health support because, you're likely to have a problem. And the others were told, we'll see you again in 6 months' time. We don't think you've got a problem. So of these 804 who went to get help, this is the number of sessions they got. And this is their mental health status roughly 6 months after they got referred, after they came back. So you can see here, 804 were advised to get help. 43% of them didn't get any help at all. They said, nah, I'm not listening to that help. I'm just going to do my own thing. 6 months later, nearly 60% of that group were well. This group here, about a third of them had 3 or more sessions of treatment. And we know that 3 sessions of treatment isn't enough. We don't know how many they had, but we know that they had at least 3 sessions. And then when you look at this group, the group who got more treatment, they only just over a third of them were doing well 6 months later. So what this data seems to suggest is that if you were identified as having a problem by a questionnaire and a healthcare provider, and then you ignored the advice to get help, you were far better off than if you acted on the advice. So that was slightly worrying because, the screening is meant to help people. It's not meant to get people into care, which makes them worse. That was against what screening was about. And so the US military decided they needed to do a randomized control trial of this. But the problem was that Congress would not let them stop screening. And so they couldn't do it in the US, which worked very well for us in the UK because we don't do screening. And so back in 2010, through lots of discussions, the US military decided to fund a trial in UK troops because they were like a virgin group of troops who hadn't had screening at all. And our team at King's College London basically set up a randomized controlled trial. We got $3 million, thank you very much to the US military. And we okayed it with the UK government. And basically we implemented a post-deployment screening process for around 9,000 British troops who had come back from Afghanistan over a couple of years. And basically it was a computer-based screening and you filled in questionnaires on the computer. If you were in the intervention arm, at the end of filling those questionnaires in, the computer gave you feedback if you wanted it. And the feedback said, either you're doing okay, don't need to do anything more now. You're not doing great, you've got some minor snags. We suggest you speak to the chaplains, to your friends, to family, to welfare staff and your colleagues. Or if you had a higher score, it said, we think you might have a mental health problem. You should go and speak to your medical officer and take this result with you, and they should then be able to help you. So they got tailored advice. The intervention in the control arm filled in the questionnaires and they just said, thank you. They didn't get any advice at all. So what we did then was to follow them up about 24 months later, or up to 24 months. It was 15 months was the mean amount. And the screening itself took place, I should have said, 6 to 12 weeks after deployment. And so primarily we were anticipating that the groups who got involved in screening would have better mental health. And importantly, they would obviously seek more mental health care. That's how their mental health would improve. However, this was published in The Lancet, it was another decent journal, and we found that looking at any particular mental health measure, this is the PTSD checklist, this is depression, anxiety, any mental health, this is the audit, so alcohol use, and this is the overall well-being of the SF-36. There was really no difference between the screened and control group. So people who got screened, in fact, didn't have better mental health than the people who didn't overall. There was no significant difference. Oh, and I should say, and also what is interesting is they also didn't seek more help. Even though they absolutely got advice to seek help when the scores were high, they were no more likely to seek help than the groups who didn't get the screening. And that might be because they didn't listen to the help, but it might also be because the people in the intervention group who felt their mental health was bad went and got help anyway. So this was no evidence of harm other than it costing a lot of money, but this was evidence that actually a randomized control trial implemented in a high-risk organization led to no positive outcomes for that group who had been exposed to trauma. And this was, at the time, the only randomized control trial of post-deployment screening that exists, and it certainly still is in military forces. And so what about healthcare delivered screening? You know, because one thing that says here is that our study, our randomized control study, didn't have a mental health care person involved in it. It was all done on a computer-based test. But actually, the US research that I mentioned earlier on that caused concern did have a healthcare professional really involved in there at 2 time points. And so we have kind of 2 bits of evidence here that suggest that post-deployment screening really doesn't really make any difference whether you have a healthcare professional or not. And certainly some of the criticisms that I've had levied over the years is, well, maybe you should have had a clinical psychologist, maybe you should have had this sort of healthcare professional, maybe you should have done that. All of which are perfectly valid criticisms, but we have to be cognizant of this evidence, which is the only evidence to date that shows that screening in a post-deployment environment doesn't work. And all these other people with good suggestions, they don't have any evidence saying that would work. They are merely suggestions that they could. We also found that there was, even when people got the advice, they didn't necessarily take up the advice, and there was no link between getting help and the mental health outcomes. And so really this throws into question the whole idea of investing a lot of money, effort and time in getting people to go through a post-deployment screening program when it doesn't seem to help. One final piece here, which I feel is slightly a nail in the coffin, is about the impact of anonymity. And so what this means is that if you're doing screening where you're asking people to fill out questionnaires, the question is, when you do that for a screening process, you have to know who they are because you want to be able to give them the advice. However, when we did a study in Iraq back in 2009, I went out to Iraq myself. I was in the military at the time, and a sergeant major who went with me, and basically went out to collect surveillance data. Now, surveillance data is non-actable data. It's not screening data. And we said to all the troops who we came into contact with, who we asked to fill in questionnaires, we said, these questionnaires are not a way of seeking help. They are not there for us to find out who needs support. Whatever you write on the questionnaire, we're not coming to find you. This is merely so we can get a feeling for how the whole force is doing in these difficult environments. And we said that to everybody. However, half of the questionnaires we handed out, there were just over about 600-ish, were completely anonymous. We didn't ask for any personal identifiers, but the other half asked for name, rank, and number. Although we reassured people this was not at all anything to do with coming to find them. We said to them it was just to make sure that people didn't fill in the same questionnaire twice. And so we had anonymous and non-anonymous data gathering. And this is the PCLC. Back when we used it, you'll probably remember a score of 50 or more was a likely suggestion of PTSD. So in the group who we had reassured we wouldn't find, but they were identifiable, so we could have identified them, about 1.7% of that deployed force appeared to have PTSD. But in the group who were wholly anonymous, the ones we couldn't have found, they had nearly 3 times the rate of PTSD. Now, this group here can't have been trying to seek help because we didn't know who they were. And so even if we wanted to try and find them, we wouldn't have been able to offer help. And what that says here is this group here who were reassured that as researchers, we weren't coming to find them, they were still massively underplaying their symptoms because they were concerned about being identified. And only when you let people know that you couldn't find them because there was no way, there was no information on the questionnaire, did people show us that, in fact, they were much more likely to have problems. So if you do screening within an organization, you're always going to ask, you know, who people are because you need to get them to come forward and get the help. And so just to say that was a UK study. This similar study has been done in the US, showing again anonymity tends to inflate symptoms, not reduce them. If you can't find people, they tend to be more truthful and they tend to report higher levels of symptoms. So where does this all lead us? It leads us to many people within an organizational setting don't tell the truth about their mental health. That's even when they're reassured that there'll be no personal outcome, even when we say this isn't screening, this is just to do surveillance. And so really, however well-intentioned, you know, ongoing monitoring or post-deployment screening, it can't work as we might like it to. Okay, David, back over to you.
Thank you very much, Neil, and a big shout out to anyone who is watching this now from Australia. It's about 1:30 in the morning here in Australia, and I take my hat off to you for hanging in there with us. So the question is, is screening futile? And really important to say is, what we don't want to do is throw the baby out with the bathwater here. So next slide, please, Neil. So then it comes back to, depends on what you mean by screening. What do we know does work? What do we know works, really? So some great work that was published by Chris Bruin and his team in the aftermath of the London bombings, where there was a kind of an outreach, assertive screen and treat approach provided to survivors of the bombings, and found it was very effective in being able to detect people who are struggling, experiencing difficulties around PTSD and other common disorders, and to be able to triage them into effective evidence-based early intervention. So screening can work really well in environments where kind of community-based, where there's an outreach approach or even a healthcare setting approach to be able to identify, detect, and then provide interventions. Next slide, please. So then further to that, is it even within kind of high-risk organisations, for example, like military organisations, improving the knowledge and skills of primary care providers to be able to screen within the healthcare settings is also showing significant promise. So the Respect Mill program, for example, within the military primary care services within the US, has found effectiveness and kind of emerging data around being able to train primary care clinicians in being able to screen, identify, triage for care, and then implement collaborative care models for PTSD and depression. But again, that's for those who are already seeking care within healthcare delivery environments. Next slide, please, now. So then it comes down to that earlier point that we discussed in the kind of the first part of the presentation, really, which is, what do we mean by screening? What are the processes that we're talking about for screening? So if we do take that broader conceptualization of screening, that broader definition, a great RCT, again, by Milligan Seville and kind of Richard Bryant and Sam Harvey's group at Black Dog, found a randomized controlled trial that kind of identified reduced sickness absence after systematically training fire station managers to routinely speak with their firefighters around their mental health. So evidence of a mental health intervention of training for station managers in reducing sickness of their workforce when being able to be trained in how to speak to their staff around mental health issues. And this, of course, these findings are really consistent with the kind of the recent recommendations that have come out of the WHO, kind of reinforcing the role of managers in protecting workers' mental health through training for managers in such things to improve the mental health kind of awareness and behaviours and help-seeking orientation of staff. In recommendation number 4 and recommendation number 5, specifically calling out the training for managers in health, humanitarian and emergency workers as well. So this RCT is really interesting, emerging strong evidence for that broader definition about screening in relation to systematic engagements from training for managers and supervisors, potentially commanders. Next slide, please, now. So then rolling out that broader definition kind of to the next onion ring is, what about social networks in being able to provide this screening and detection process and to be able to support help seeking. And some really interesting work in the community reinforcement and family training program, the CRAFT program, that's been developed and used in the VA settings in the US, in problem gamblers, in PTSD and depression, with a small trial also being used in the UK military with positive results, which is training for family members and community members in the identification and support of members of either veterans or members of high-risk organisations in being able to seek care, training what to look for, training in what questions to ask, training in supporting help-seeking behaviours. So expanding out the definition of screening and detection, if you like, to primary care environments through to training managers through a kind of supervision and formal hierarchical managers within organisations, and then to the social networks and family networks of the members as well, kind of showing some evidence for being effective around detection and referral and help seeking. Next slide, please, now. So what does all this then mean for organisations and also for the leaders of these trauma-exposed or trauma-prone organisations? So one is that despite its widespread use, the current evidence, as Neil has detailed in a fair level of specificity, the current evidence really doesn't support the effectiveness of mandated, required, imposed, if you like, mental health screenings in organisations. So that evidence at the moment is lacking for its effectiveness. So there's 5 points for thinking about in terms of what do we do with that information. So one is, if screening is used, there really needs to be a cognizance of the fact that it's got to be part of a systemic approach to supporting workers' mental health more broadly. And this has got to include, particularly given issues around anonymity that Neil has identified, it's got to include fostering an organisational culture that minimises the disincentives for staff to engage honestly. That odds ratio of 3 to 4 times more likely to report if it's anonymous. It really speaks to this issue about disincentives for identifiable reporting. And screening can also only work really if it leads to timely evidence-based interventions. And again, with that expanded definition, if we use that extended definition, the good evidence around genuine and skillful supervisor questioning and asking staff about their wellbeing post-incident, also showing some benefit. Next slide, please, now. And again, expanding that definition around what we mean by screening, really building up the social and family networks and being able to identify and refer, and workplace peers and families as well, to be able to identify and refer and support the member to self-refer. And finally, evidence does show that if there's early intervention provided, this early intervention can be effective. It's a matter of being able to provide the identification processes. They're going to work and they're going to align with values and mission. And a lot of studies, pathways to care studies in the US, UK, Canada, Australia, these pathways to care studies show that workers often prefer to self-manage their mental health problems. So the potential for kind of adding in self-screening for those who wish it, leading to targeted self-management programs, and then access to evidence-based care through those pathways is definitely worth studying. Next slide, please, now. So what now? What's the culmination of all of those points? So one is, it's easy to see why screening is an attractive option. It has the sense also that the organisation is providing an overt demonstration of their care for their workers, for their personnel. But the evidence is lacking that it works within organisational settings, particularly when it's mandated or imposed. It can be useful in already help-seeking populations or within populations where the career or attitudinal impact of responses is less of an issue. But we need to be really cognizant, and some of the data that Neil showed, really cognizant about the risks associated with screening as well, in terms of kind of labelling those as ill who aren't ill, or those that may not be able to manage future exposures when they indeed can, or false reassurance about the health of the workforce when in fact there's a lot of underreporting that's occurring. And critical, improving access to support and help seeking might be better addressed through other means, through leaders, through peers, through colleagues, through families, and through building up those screening services for those already seeking care. So thank you. That was the information that Neil and I wanted to go through with you today. Hope that was helpful and useful, and we'll throw back to Melissa at this point for next step. Thank you.
Thank you both. This was a wonderful presentation. I have been keeping an eye on the chat, and I know that we have already had one major question come in, and there's some other smaller things I'd like to address. But just for folks, so that you know, please do use that Q&A feature in the chat to submit your questions. I've also been told it is possible for you to raise your hand virtually, and ISTSS staff may be able to help you unmute to ask a question. So those are the two options for questions. The first question that I saw come in the chat is the construct of psychological safety implied in all of these findings? Is training on this for managers worthwhile?
Well, I'll say something on that briefly. So I don't think from my reading of the literature that particular construct has been discussed in specifically to do with screening, but it absolutely is relevant. As David said, you need all parts of the system, all parts of the plumbing need to work together. And if we don't have an organization where there is psychological safety, the chance of someone putting their hand up and saying, I've got a problem, is very much reduced. And of course, this is a technically wicked problem, a problem to which there's no answer easily found, because on one hand you want people to put their hand up and say, look, I've got early trauma symptoms, I might have PTSD, and so you want those people to come forward and get help. But on the other hand, if they do put their hand up and get help, there is a chance that they won't be able to carry on doing that job. That's a frank reality. And so organizations need to tread a careful middle ground between encouraging people to come forward, but also not lying to them and saying, if you tell us you have a problem, we guarantee you will not lose your job, because you can't do that. And before we all think that that's terrible and unfair, it's exactly the same for physical health problems. If you happen to be in the US Marine Corps and you break your leg, and which of course you can't hide very easily, there is a chance that even when you get the best rehabilitation and the best care, that you may never get back to the point that you can carry on marching with a pack on. So you might have to be restricted or in duties, or you might have to be discharged. And so I know I've drifted a bit from psychological safety, but we do need to make sure that an organization is as psychologically safe as it can be, but we also have to acknowledge that there is a tension between asking people to be honest with their organization and recognizing that there may be consequences to that.
All right, we have another question in the chat. It said, thank you, really helpful. Are there any studies that track the efficacy of non-mandated check-ins?
I'll let David come in, but just the study that David mentioned, and there's been a few of these which looked at community setting post London bombings data. What that shows is very much a non-mandated screening process. So the characteristic of that process is that 3,000, I think it was, questionnaires were sent out to people in London who were thought to be heavily involved or in the local area of the London bombings, and they didn't get very many of those questionnaires back. So no one had to fill them in. It was sent out by the health service with the idea, if you think we would like to help you, please fill this in and we'll let you know how we think you're doing. And so what David told us is that the people who did send questionnaires back, which was a minority, many of those had mental health difficulties, and when they went forward and got care, many of them got better. So I think that's in a community setting. And again, I think, and David and I have discussed this at length, that one of the attractive things that organizations could do, but needs evaluation, is making non-mandatory screening processes available. Saying to staff, if you are worried about your mental health, or if other people have said to you they're worried about it, use this anonymous set of questionnaires that no one's going to know about, to see how you're actually doing. And our National Health Service in the UK has set up this sort of system. And for a while, at least, it was quite snazzy, because it did that. It encouraged staff to come forward and use it. And at the end of it, if you had a problem, it would either direct you, if you wanted to, towards self-help materials that were evidence-based, or if you wanted to put your name in and say, actually, having seen all this, I would like some help, you put your name and details in, then someone from from the NHS Wellbeing Service would have got back to you to deliver that care. Unfortunately, that's changed now for one reason or another. So I do think non-mandatory screening has got a potential to draw in people who otherwise wouldn't know how to access care. But the key point is, as David says, there has to be care available at the end. There's no point in merely saying, yes, Neil, you have a mental health problem. There's a 6-month wait to, get some guided self-help. That's just not helpful.
And just thank you for that, Neil. And just to add to that, the care is available and that it's evidence-based care as well, that we're confident that it's something that's going to be a helpful source of intervention. And just in relation to that question as well, again, it depends on what you mean. What is a non-mandated check-in? In some respects, the training of managers to be doing just routine checking in, not mandated in terms of people's responses, is a form of non-mandated check-ins as well. And that did show the Milligan-Seville study, did show evidence around the effectiveness of that in terms of worker illness anyway. But coming back to Neil's point, I think that a number of militaries, a number of emergency service organisations are starting to implement now kind of the potential for people to do self-check-ins and then to kind of triage to online material. But there's a lot of evaluation work that needs to be done to be able to refine that process. But it's certainly emerging, and I think a very fertile line of inquiry and more likely to be effective, and aligns with everything we know from pathways, numerous pathways to care studies.
I'm going to jump to a question that I think dovetails with some of what y'all were just talking about. So someone had asked, are there any articles that support the statement on the penultimate slide, point 5, workers often prefer to self-manage mental health problems? So I can imagine extrapolating from some of what y'all were talking about, but I don't know if there's anything you want to add kind of speaking to that directly.
Other than, for example, one example being us within Australia doing a kind of pathways to care study as part of our national prevalence study of our military service personnel, and then those transitioning to kind of veteran post-service veteran status, where significant number, high proportions, in fact, the majority had endorsed their preference to be able to self-manage issues and problems, and then to be able to kind of seek care on their own volition in their own way, some of which might be known to the system, some of which might be not, and a lot of which is focused on self-management processes as well. So that's drawn from, using ours as an example, kind of, very, very large, hot, national prevalence databases, but also that's very consistent with what is being reported across international studies across the US and Canada and the UK specifically.
Yeah, and our military data and also data with healthcare workers says the same thing, that they have a high preference for wanting to self-help. So if you looked at our www.kcmhr.org, which is King Centre of Military Health Research.org, there's a publications list there, and you can download all the publications. Don't tell the journals in case anyone wants to. But yeah, so but there is that. Across military forces, certainly westernized military forces across the world, there is definitely a strong preference for self-help, which, if you think about it, fits very much in with the way that military and indeed emergency responder organizations are trained. You're trained not to become a casualty yourself, to keep going. And with that training in mind, it makes complete sense that if you have difficulties, you're trying to find a way to fix them yourselves. Fixing yourself also, I think, comes from an element of stigma, that if I can fix it myself, then no one needs to know. But yes, so there is definitely there is published evidence to support that.
And just acknowledging we had kind of a comment to that point too in the chat about kind of issues of trivialization, stigmatization, and professional culture kind of being relevant to this. So thank you for that as well. This one is a little bit of a different question than the last. How do you see the setting of paraprofessional community workers who are working with traumatized young families in their own community and have most likely endured similar adversities to their clients? Might screening be of use in identifying their vulnerabilities? Can't help feeling it's neglect to not start out with protection from the get-go.
Actually, it's a really interesting question because many people, particularly, and obviously that's asking about a specific group. But if you look at healthcare, for instance, and healthcare obviously is a huge employer across the whole of the globe, is that many people go into healthcare roles because they have got some personal experience themselves that draws them that way. People become child social workers to deal with, abused children because they've got their personal experiences as well some of the time. And the question comes is, should we allow these people with those personal experiences to do those roles because they may be more vulnerable as a result of those adverse experiences to develop problems themselves? Again, like any good scientific psychosocial problem, there is no easy answer. I think the way I think about these things is it's absolutely right to advise people going into those roles that they're likely to be psychologically challenging. We need people to go into those roles with their eyes open as to what might happen and not to have a sort of halo effect of I'm here to save and I won't think of anybody else. My personal view is that when you look at the evidence of risk factors, who develops PTSD and who doesn't, although having an adverse childhood absolutely increases your risk of having problems, it's nowhere near as important as the impacts of what's done when people are in those high risk roles. And by that, I mean that if you take someone who has been warned that this is a challenging role, maybe they can fill in a questionnaire if they want to. I certainly don't think they should be excluded from doing those roles because of any questionnaire or interviews. I think they can exclude themselves if they want to, knowing the information, but they shouldn't be excluded by others. Is that once they're in the role, everybody in those high threat roles should be exposed to suitable levels of support and access to care. And actually, if you provide really good care and good support, then I think that's far more important than trying to exclude people on the basis of quasi-scientific and not very useful risk factor identification before they go into it. So the short answer is, buyer beware, make sure they really know, but I would not exclude them. I don't know if David, you've got a view.
Yeah, and just particularly to pick up on that second point, really, which is often when we talk about trauma-prone organisations or workforces that are trauma-exposed by virtue of the routine work that's done, we talk about military, we talk about emergency services, increasingly about healthcare providers. But those people that are in roles, workers that are in roles where they're exposed to trauma routinely and vicarious traumatisation, they're also kind of trauma-prone organisations in many respects also. So the idea of all of the principles we've talked about here are applying there as well, in terms of the kind of the awareness of the potential impacts, embedding things that are going to be helpful in terms of detection, support, and guidance, but also some of the caveats around mandating and around some of those unintended consequences around identification. All of those elements still apply as well in relation to organisations who work in that context. So it's very, very much part of our thinking when we talk about trauma-prone organisations. Of course, some of those people are working in private settings, not necessarily in organisational settings, in their communities of practice or organisations, kind of supervision, mentoring, and methods of built-in support are critical. But where it is in an organisational context, I think everything we've described applies today.
Can I just jump in there? Just so I did, because there's not another question, but actually on the point of employers versus contractors as well, which I think is a really important issue, is that one of the big ways that many ex-military and some ex-emergency services personnel get employment when they leave their organization is they go into the private security world, and most people who work in that world are contractors. There's contractors in lots of other organizations too, like the oil industry, like the media and the like. Now, the difficulty of being a contractor is that if you were to engage in a screening program that identified you as having a problem, because you're not an employee, there is actually therefore much less of a legal duty to provide you with care and to provide you with support. They shouldn't damage you, but if you're a private security contractor and there's 10 people wanting every job and you've got a problem, they just won't renew your contract, or at least that's your fear. They'll go and choose one of the other 9 people who they could choose. So it's even more difficult for people who work as contractors to put their hand up and ask for support because they don't have a stable contract of employment. That's something worth thinking about if you happen to deal with, say, aid agencies or any organization that has a group of people who are employed who still have problems like we have discussed. But if you're contracted to that organization, the difficulties are even greater.
And we've had two questions come in kind of related to peer support. So I'm going to jump to that next, and maybe also looking at the time, nest this within a higher part two that you could consider if you have thoughts about tacking on as well. So one person just kind of asked, what about peer support? Another person asked, what about more culturally appropriate sensitive screening and treatment, like peer support, for example, in cultures where collective culture is more the case? And I think my nest, just looking at time that I would also ask, is just kind of knowing what you know. If an organization was set to embark on something like this tomorrow, like what would you recommend?
So if I just jump in on peer support, because it's one of the things I've done lots on. So, I mean, we did a Delphi study issue. I'm sure, David, you were involved. It was, I think you might have even led it, or Mark might have led it. So we did a what should peer support in high risk organizations look like? And basically, this was a Delphi study of experts done, published in 2012, which is 12 years ago, a long time now. And basically, there were 4 elements to what peer support in a high risk organization should do. The first is it should have people who can listen properly. That's not surprising. The second is they should be able to offer very basic level interventions. And that's not talking about psychotherapies. That's talking about problem solving, helping people solve practical problems like work shifts and the like. The next thing they should be able to do is identify people who remain at increased risk, even when support has been provided. And the last thing they should be able to do is to refer those people through to mental health professionals like us, so that we can do an assessment and deliver care. So that's what peer support should do in a high risk organization. And there are a number of programs out there across the globe which do that. And I have a conflict of interest here, so I'll declare it. But I run a program called TRIM, Trauma Risk Management, that has been running from our British Royal Marines back in the late 1990s and is now used certainly by lots of the UK military and emergency services and healthcare. So not trying to sell TRIM, but the concepts of TRIM, which are useful no matter what peer support you have, is that you take people who are volunteers within an organization and you give them some training, which does not turn them into a diagnostician at all. But what it does is enable them to spot those who've got problems, to have a informal conversation with people who are trauma exposed. They should do that at least a couple of times, because they can monitor people over time, because we know an instantly distressing response to trauma may be normal. It's only if it's persistent and impairing it's a problem. And they help the organization to properly manage them, so they don't perhaps send them off on a difficult duty straight after a trauma. They keep them somewhere close and give them good access to support. So that sort of peer support definitely has an evidence base. We've got over 15 publications on TRIM, and that's just an example. And basically, this is not penicillin for trauma, but it absolutely is a credible way that empowers social support and improves the capability of organizations to spot people who've got problems and get them to care.
Just to add to that, kind of endorsing really what Neil's saying, and it really does fit with what we described as that kind of broader definition of building up the competency of the network for the managers and supervisors and commanders, peers, families, social networks, primary care providers and other care providers, really building up that network approach. And peers are, as Neil has detailed, a really core part of that. And also for reasons of cultural sensitivity relating to the second part of that question as well, is what peers can deliver in relation to cultural sensitivity as well.
All right, well, thank you both very much. This has been an incredible presentation, very, very valuable. There have been a couple of questions about recording and meeting materials and such, and I did just want to confirm that our webinar today was recorded and will be available on the ISTSS website for members, as well as distributed to attendees. All right. I'm seeing a couple of other questions, comments that we didn't get a chance to get to. I apologize for that. But just, we're at the hour, so I just want to say thank you again to Professor Forbes and Professor Greenberg for an incredible webinar today. Thank you very much. And thank you to all who attended. Take care.
Thank you
very much.